Re-Zero, Volume 6, Chapter 3, Part 2, The Maw of the White Whale. It was another 2 hours until all preparations to pull out of the campsite had been completed. After the freight was transferred to the 4 large dragon carriages, Subaru and the others departed along the highway by night. There were 11 dragon carriages heading toward the Mother's domain. It might prove somewhat cramped, but they should be more than enough to get all the villagers out. Otto called to him as his dragon carriage ran parallel to Subaru's. By running half through the night, we'll probably arrive in the Mother's domain near morning. It was the land dragon's wind repel blessing that enabled them to have a normal conversation while the 2 dragon carriages ran side by side. It did more than nullify the effects of wind and vibrations on them, apparently. Sorry to make you keep running without a break. Not at all. I have no complaints. Now that I can dispose of my stock and defray the freight costs, I'm invincible. I can keep this up for 3 days and nights. And then you can fall asleep right after the deal is done. Huh? Did you read my mind? The punchline to a classic joke was stolen right out of Otto's mouth. From there, Subaru shifted his gaze toward Rem, holding the reins behind him. He could not read any emotion on the side of her face. She stared straight ahead. To Subaru, it wasn't a very pleasant situation. Subaru? Yeah? What is it, Rem? Something's up? No, it's quiet, so I wondered if you might be tired. The dust makes for poor visibility, but with the other land dragons about, the path is not uncertain. If you are sleepy, it is all right for you to rest. I'm happy to hear you say that. It's not cool to make you do all the work. But Subaru, you're still convalescing, so... Rem's considerate stance towards Subaru made him shut his mouth. Her manner of speaking was gentle, but there was a stubborn, steely will behind it. He keenly understood that she wished to reduce the burden on him as much as possible. Her tenacious efforts made him fearful that he didn't know her true intentions. The thorns he could not dislodge from his chest were the product of both wanting to know and not wanting to know. Rem, do... Yes? Subaru's breath caught as Rem's pale blue eyes stared at him, as if seeing right through him. He wanted some way to redirect her attention from his doubting, hesitant silence, but Subaru shook his head, brushing aside such thoughts. If he doubted Rem's intentions enough that it hurt, it was far better to get them out in the open. Rem, do you have any doubts about what I'm doing? I didn't explain anything to you. Not about the witch cult, not about the traveling merchants. He was painfully aware of how Rem had kindly indulged him in spite of his duty to explain himself. That was precisely why he was worried about how Rem felt about following him without question or debate. Rem closed her eyes but once to Subaru's question. Master Roswell told me to respect your actions in the royal capital. Subaru's expression stiffened, reply leaving him lost for words. Roswell told you to? Yes. He did not command me to do any specific thing, but rather to go along with your plans in the royal capital, whatever they might be. I also planned to do as much as I could. Roswell's orders. Rem's words somehow weren't sinking into his skull. Instead, the fact that Roswell had ordered Rem repeated itself in his head, over and over. Rem's lack of dissent towards Subaru's actions because her master had directed her to shut up and obey. Did that mean, in other words, that Rem's actions to that point had not been of her own will? Hell, even her staying by his side at that very moment might not have been. Subaru? Subaru fell silent. Rem peered at him, her shapely eyebrows drawing together. Yet, in that moment, Subaru was unable to take even that expression of concern at face value. I'm all right. It's nothing. Shaking his head to flee from Rem's gaze, Subaru gave a perfunctory reply to keep the peace. Their caring concert, her support when he was on the brink of collapse, her being by the isolated Subaru's side, all because of Broswell's orders. Beyond that, deep down, did Rem approve of what Subaru was doing? His paranoia brought bile up from his stomach. Subaru swallowed down the acidic liquid filling his mouth. With his nausea having nowhere else to go, fright and despondency raged inside his body. His limbs felt numb, his vision narrowed, and there was an unbearable physical itch in his brain. His breath was ragged as he fought the urgent desire to crack his skull open and jab his fingers in to scratch it. He didn't want to think about anything. The more he thought about things, the more he mulled over them. The more he sought answers, the more distant his desires would become. The more his ideals would turn to fantasies, and his dreams to hopelessness and despair. Subaru, did you fall asleep? He hated it. He wanted no more of it. He didn't want to think. He didn't want to doubt. He didn't want to trust. He didn't want to be betrayed. He clutched his head, shutting himself in and cutting off all responses to the outside world. Rem called his name several times. Seeing that there was no response, she gave up after a while and shifted her gaze back to the highway. By then, Subaru had finally, by his own hand, become truly alone in that world. Rue, I'm sorry, Subaru. Please wake up. Subaru sensed someone calling him and shaking him awake. A touch on his shoulder roused him from the abyss of unconsciousness. He absent-mindedly rubbed his eyelids with his hand and opened his eyes. He found the familiar face of a girl right in front of him. Rem, what's wrong? The instant he was sure it was Rem, Subaru remembered their exchange before he slept. He felt a dull ache in his chest. Rem, not noticing how hard Subaru was working to endure that pain, lowered her head apologetically. After another brief apology for waking him, she said, "We are about to reach a fork in the road. As it is a landmark that cannot be mistaken, even in the dead of night, it should be all right. But I want to be certain before we reach it." The area around them was filled with deep darkness. Even with Rem sitting right beside him, her face seemed indistinct. The crystal lamp hanging from the land dragon's neck and a simple light attached to the dragon carriage itself provided the only illumination. There was very little to go on, if not for the land dragons with good night vision, then certainly for the humans. I see your point. What do you want me to do, though? I want you to check the map, but I cannot take my hands off the reins. I put the map in the sack at your feet. Could you get it out for me? At my feet. This, huh? In the dark, he pulled over a fairly heavy sack. He set it on his lap and thrust in his hand to fish around, but finding what he was after proved rather difficult. I can't even tell what's a map and what's not. Isn't it too dark to even read it? That is... that could be a problem. What shall we do? Yeah, what can we? No, wait a sec. Ren's expression was clouded when a light suddenly turned on in Subaru's head. Once again, he searched at his feet, picking something out from a different sack, the one with Subaru's personal belongings. Oh, I found it! He took out the object, cool and hard to the touch, and thrust it in Rem's face. Right in front of her wide eyes, Subaru pressed the power button of something he hadn't held in ages. It hasn't been charged in a while, so I hope the battery isn't dead. Oh! After a single tense moment, the boot up sequence appeared on the screen. A few seconds later, a dazzling light shone from Subaru's hand. Rem looked at Subaru with surprise at the brilliant sight. Subaru, what's that? Lost technology, or future technology. A cell phone. Looks like it still has a little juice left, luckily for us. The cell phone had been off ever since his generous use of it on the day he had been summoned to this other world. It was one of Subaru's few possessions from home. He had a few other personal belongings, but this was by far the priciest and most useful, at least as long as its battery held out. I never imagined the next time I'd use it would be as a flashlight, though. Using it in a manner inconsistent with its original purpose, Subaru shone the light of civilization upon the contents of the luggage. After he easily found the map he'd been searching for in the sack, Subaru spread it out over Rem's lap. I'll shine this on the map, so take a look-see. Yes, thank you very much. At that moment, Otto poked his head in from the side, his interest keenly piqued. Mr. Notsky, what is that? I've never seen such a thing. Leaning over from his dragon carriage immediately to the left, he tilted his head in confusion. A crystal lamp I have never seen before. No, not a crystal. It seems to be made of some material unfamiliar to me. Noticing Otto's reaction, a man in his prime, with a bandana wrapped around his head, pulled his dragon carriage along the right side as well. The eyes of the driver glimmered as his gaze remained pinned to Subaru's cell phone. Ordinarily, the reactions would have doubtlessly brightened Subaru's mood, inspiring him to casually show off and brag. However, the current Subaru was in no mood for such pleasantries. Sorry, it's a secret item the Marquis gave to me. If I told you about it, you might vanish without a trace. Best forget you ever saw it. Ooh, that secretive explanation just reeks of money. Otto's interest seemed to have only deepened. Before a long cover-up conversation became necessary, Rem lifted her head from the map and nodded. I realize where we are now. A little farther, and we should be able to see the great flugel tree. From there, we take the road northeast and enter the Mather's domain shortly after. The great flugel tree? Subaru inclined his head at the unfamiliar term. Otto raised a finger. The great flugel tree is a huge tree found along the Liffus Highway that seems to pierce the very clouds. The tree really is huge, like you wouldn't believe. According to legend, a sage named Flugel planted it. So that's why it's the great flugel tree. Why did the sage do that anyway? Well, this was hundreds of years ago, you see. Aside from the story of how he planted the tree, next to nothing is known about the flugel. Not even why he is treated as a sage. The hell is that? Why even treat him like a big shot if you don't even know what good he's done? Subaru was itching to hear the rest after Otto's incomplete account, but when he saw that Rem and the other merchants weren't adding to the story, it was apparent that his exploits really hadn't been passed down. Subaru mulled over the thought, and around half an hour later, he saw the great tree for himself, to his shock. Whoa. Yeah, incredible is about the only word I can use for it. Venerable tree, its branches rising into the night sky, towered over Subaru and the others with an overwhelming presence. Its size dwarfed the trees from his old world that were often said to be more than 1,000 years old. According to Otto, this specimen was centuries old, making Subaru wonder if plants grew at a much faster pace in his current world. Before he realized it, he was seized by a considerable sense of awe. The enormous tree had put down its roots not in a great forest, but alone in an open field. Along the Liffus Highway, there was no landmark more prominent. Passing by the calmly towering great tree, the dragon carriages headed northeast in accordance with the map. As the distance to the Mather's domain lessened, Subaru finally began to feel little regret at leaving the great tree behind. Jeez, this isn't the time to get all sentimental. Er, Uh, if he had been less troubled, he might have taken a picture with it of his cell phone. Subaru, who was sitting at the driver's seat when he had thought, felt uneasy as he redirected his attention from the great tree. Where did the bandana guy on the right of us go? Subaru could see no sign of the dragon carriage owner, who had shown interest in his cell phone while running on their right. Subaru checked behind him to see if he had suddenly slowed down, but he saw only the dragon carriage that had been running behind the bandana man. He was gone from the convoy, leaving an empty space. Don't tell me he was so enchanted by the big tree that he wandered off. What is it, Mr. Notsky? Are you looking for something? Not something. One of your guys. The one who was running on the side till just now. A manly-looking guy with a bandana. This ain't the time to go tree climbing like a little kid. Subaru harshly answered the carefree Otto with sarcasm, inwardly scolding him for the poor management. But Otto, on the receiving end of that annoyance, stared blankly and tilted his head, as if he had no idea what Subaru meant. What are you talking about? No one's been on the opposite side of you. Huh? Subaru's mouth hung open, and the meaning of the reply failed to sink in. What are you saying? He was all curious and staring at my cell phone just earlier, same as you. Ah, so it's called a cell phone. Wait, can you guarantee my safety for having heard that? I don't want to disappear. Don't play games with me! Subaru roared at Otto, who was casually ignoring Subaru's question, as if he thought it was all some big joke. Subaru looked to the right again. The gap was as wide as before, and the carriage that should have been there was nowhere to be found. Then, as Subaru stared at the gap, his field of vision suddenly became indistinct. He sensed a blur, as if there was a haze right before his eyes. Subaru blinked several times, but that did not wipe away his unease. The dark, empty space continued to run parallel to Subaru and Urim's dragon carriage. The darkness was terribly ominous. He couldn't help the nervousness welling up inside him. That was why Subaru opened his folded cell phone, shining light upon the gap to drive away the darkness. He meant to look for a trace of the person who should have been there, and to ascertain the source of the uncanny feeling that just wouldn't go away. And within the shining light... There, floating in space, Subaru meant a truly gigantic eye. The next moment, something roared, and mist covered the Lippus plains. Mist.